And yeah, I thought we'd talk about the Battle of Aspern-Essling today. It took place not far from where we were there in Vienna in May 1809. And it represents a number of firsts. Napoleon's first defeat in 10 years as commander since the Siege of Acre in 1799, his first setback as emperor, and his first loss to the Austrians in a long time. Which of these is the most significant in your opinion?
Well, Aspern is very significant in the fact that it destroys the whole aura of invincibility surrounding Napoleon and the Grande Armée. So, 4 years before, at Austerlitz and, at Ulm, the Austrians were absolutely, destroyed, very easily by Napoleon and the Grande Armée. And Austria had to reform afterwards, and nobody ever thought that he would lose, especially after, Vienna and Auerstadt in 1806. The emperor was unbeatable. And now after Aspern-Essling, it shows that, he can be beaten. And it should have shown Napoleon, in theory, that these aren't the same bunglers that he faced in 1805 and 1806, but he'll still always hold this contempt for the Austrians that'll even plague him in 1813.
Right, right. Well, let's discuss the background a little bit. It's 1809 is the year. And as you mentioned, Austria was humiliated in 1805 after Ulm and Austerlitz. So they spent those years kind of licking their wounds, rebuilding their army, reforming it, and waiting for the right moment to challenge Napoleon again. What do you think spurred the Austrians to do this again? Because, like you said, they lost in Italy to Napoleon, at Marengo to Napoleon, and again at Austerlitz. Was it the French defeat at the 1808 Battle of Bailén in Spain? Or was it the loss of their territory after Austerlitz, or was it something else?
Well, there's a lot. I have 7 here for why they opt for war in 1809. Obviously, the insurrection in Spain is important, but there's a lot of other things going on behind the scenes. The Spanish one's important because a lot of the Grande Armée is going to be in Spain fighting the Spanish. So that's going to tie down a lot of soldiers. But we can actually go back in time to 1808 in October at the Erfurt Conference, where Napoleon calls all these monarchs of Europe together, not necessarily to talk about much, but basically just to make sure that he's got his political stability in order before he goes off to Spain to crush the insurrection there. However, the main reason he calls that is to talk to Tsar Alexander, to make sure that he keeps an eye on the Austrians, because Napoleon had always feared that the Austrians would want to get back at him for, taking territory in Italy. He wanted to make sure that Alex would honor the treaty that he signed at Tilsit. And Alex, to his face, is like, yeah, I'm loyal to the treaty and all that. However, what Napoleon doesn't know is that behind the scenes, Alexander had told the Austrians that he would remain neutral in a war between Austria and France. So they have, I don't want to say a blank check like, the Austrians get in World War I, but they have, kind of freedom to do what they want and make sure that the Russians don't invade. So in Spain now, it's been a couple months. January they start mobilizing. The Spanish ulcer is already taking its toll on France, and Wellesley, who's not Wellington yet, was defeating French subordinates left and right. And, with the Spanish guerrillas tying forces down, it's a good time to strike. Also, Napoleon and the French had a nasty habit of not honoring treaties and being way too aggressive in their foreign policy. So Francis, the Emperor of Austria, Francis I, was really fearful that Napoleon was going to just eliminate the Habsburg monarchy altogether. Why would he think that? He did the same thing to the Holy Roman Empire, an empire that lasted 1,000 years. Napoleon just signed away with a pen. The other critical factor is Metternich, Clemens von Metternich, who is the ambassador to France now, will become foreign minister after this. He persuades Francis that the time is right now, because France uses conscription heavily. And he is convinced that the French are getting sick and tired of the war, that conscription is taking its toll. Remember, this is a country that's been at war constantly since 1792. And they started the levée en masse on August 10th, 1793. So millions of men have been enrolled in the army. And Metternich's convinced that, they're sick and tired of the war. Just keep pressing them, they'll give up. Fourthly, we talked about this briefly, is that the Austrian army had been reformed after Ulm and Austerlitz. Now, these reforms hadn't been tested yet, but in theory, they were going to perform very well. Led by Archduke Charles, who is the best commander the Austrians had, and other than Wellesley and Wellington, and Blucher probably the best opponent Napoleon faced. They had adopted the corps systems, and they adopted what's called a landwehr, which is a citizen militia to enroll mass numbers in the army and also provide sort of a civilian defense force to drastically increase the size of the Austrian army. So not battle tested yet, but a lot of reformers within the Austrian army think that this force can now maybe defeat Napoleon. Fifth point, you hit the nail on the head. They lost a lot of territory, so revenge. Revenge is obviously something very important here because they haven't beat the French in a long time, so they're sick of losing. So now they see a time to strike. Sixth is they also take another example from the Spanish. The Spanish, as a lot of our listeners may know, were very good because of a civilian insurrection, popular uprising. That hadn't been done yet in the territories in Austria and modern-day Germany. However, they are convinced that they can take a page out of the Spanish playbook. Count Philip Stadion, their foreign minister at this point, raised the idea of a nationalistic uprising, or the German term a Volkskrieg, People's War, in the states of the Confederation of the Rhine, the territories that are forced into a military alliance against France. He's convinced that, just a little bit of force and a little bit of propaganda, Stadion starts distributing pamphlets in places like Brunswick and Hesse-Kassel to cast off the French yoke, these foreign dominators. What he doesn't realize is that a lot of people actually benefit from French rule, and that the princes who rule these territories, they get a lot of benefit, like Württemberg or one of these territories where the prince, doubles his territory and his dominion. So why would he want to give that up? Mm-hmm. But they think in theory that, you appeal to the masses, they will just obviously go after the French. And this is bolstered by, my last point is that there was an uprising in the Tyrol under Andreas Hofer, which convinced many that, this could work. And it's also important to note that the British threw a lot of money at them, like the British always do. They promised to invade somewhere in North Germany, and the British actually do uphold this promise, and their invasion takes place at a place called Walcheren, but that's a disaster. I'll let somebody else in an episode on the British military talk about Walcheren fever and the disaster that was that. So there's a lot of reasons going for why the Austrians declare war. But if you wanted to boil it down to one, it's that Napoleon's occupied. So if not now, when?
Yeah, I think of all your points, the second one's the most intriguing one to me. I never really thought about it. Just the literal survival of the Habsburg Empire and their throne. You mentioned the whole Roman Empire, but also the Venetian Republic was, gotten rid of, or at least eliminated. Napoleon just said, no, we're not doing that anymore. Also, the Spanish House of Bourbon, they were imprisoned basically in France. And the Portuguese royal family had to flee to Brazil. Yeah, maybe Francis is just looking at it like, all right, well, we're next on the chopping block, so maybe we should just try our chances again at war with Napoleon before our empire's gone.
And at Tilsit, Napoleon was on the verge of eliminating Prussia, negotiating it away before Alexander stepped in and saved him a little bit. But the Habsburgs and, the territory of the Austrian Empire, they're very kind of behind the times, but they're very reliant on treaties and honor and tradition to keep alive. This is a multi-ethnic polity. There's hundreds of cultures and ethnicities. So there's a lot of flimsiness holding it together. And, just one strong kick in the door might knock down the whole foundation.
All right. Let's get to the Battle of Aspern-Essling and how we get there in the campaigning. So after some initial trouble at the start of the war, when Marshal Berthier was de facto in charge because Napoleon was in Paris, Napoleon shows up, the French defeat the Austrians in a series of battles at Ebensburg, Eckmühl, and Ratisbon, and others. So how do we get to Aspern-Essling, it's just a suburb, right? Like right outside of Vienna?
Yeah, it's just a couple miles east. It's very, very small. It's bigger now than it was back then, but yeah, it's on the other side of the Danube River. So it must be noted that, Marshal Berthier, Napoleon's wife, whatever nickname you want to use for him, great chief of staff, great hand, very good at taking Napoleon's long-winded orders and diffusing them down into, a coherent piece of paper. Very bad independent commander. And he's lucky that Marshal Davout is as good as he is. We'll get to that. Mm-hmm. So Charles, launches the Ratisbon campaign, and the Austrians get lucky. Napoleon thought that they wouldn't be ready until 17 April to launch an attack. But the Austrians were actually a week ahead of schedule They launch a surprise attack, occupy Bavaria and Munich, encircle almost Marshal Davout because Berthier was so slow in getting orders out and he didn't know the strategic situation. So he gets lucky. Davout was sitting there, at Regensburg, about to get encircled before Napoleon arrived and kind of saved the whole thing. And also, Davout at the Battle of what's called Teugn-Hausen fights off the Austrians, miraculously and saves his corps. Then Napoleon launches this brilliant 4-day campaign where he tries a double envelopment of the Austrian army, which doesn't quite succeed because Napoleon makes a mistake. He thought that General Hiller's force, the one he faced, was the main Austrian army. It wasn't. So Davout, once again, is isolated at Eckmühl with only 20,000 men facing Charles and 70,000. Davout is, again, up against it, much like he was at Auerstadt, saves his corps from destruction because of its hard fighting, and also because Napoleon quickly realizes his mistake. Owen Connolly, the great historian, said Napoleon blundered in this case, which he does. He makes a mistake, but this shows the power of the French military system is that he quickly realizes a mistake and dispatches Lannes to help Davout. They force march 22 miles and save Davout's corps at Eckmühl. So because of Davout's heroic actions here, that's why he becomes the Prince of Eckmühl from 1809 onwards. Something else worth noting, though, another mistake that Napoleon makes. After Eckmühl, Charles is going to retreat. Napoleon has two options. One, seek and destroy. Pursue Charles's army, wipe him out. Or he can march on Vienna. He can march on Vienna, take the capital. He thought Charles would defend it, so that could be a chance to destroy his army there. And he chooses option 2, march on Vienna, but we're getting to that. It's a very controversial decision.
Yeah.
But why is it important to talk about? In the old days of the Grande Armée, 1805 and 6, no doubt would have sent him after Charles, would have wiped him out. However, this is not the same Grande Armée that it was in 1805 and 6. They're either all dead at Eylau, after that bloodbath in the snow, or they're in Spain. So these are conscripts from the German territories.
Yeah.
And his army's exhausted. So he can't conduct the same type of maneuvers that he used to in 1805, 6, and 7. So he kind of just sends it after Vienna, hoping that'll end the war. Charles abandons it after a small artillery bombardment, and then retreats across the Danube River and is waiting for Napoleon on the other side with 115,000 men.
You wonder if it, and I don't want to get into that doctrine too much, because you're right. In Napoleon's early years, he would just find the enemy army, seek it out, and destroy it. In his later years, maybe starting with this, he's more focused on capturing capitals and cities like Vienna and Moscow and Berlin later in 1813, instead of just seeking out and destroying the army like he did in his early years. So, yeah, it's a little bit of a dynamic change. So, like you said, Archduke Charles and the Austrian army kind of retreat out of Vienna. They just make it an open city without destroying the city. Napoleon takes over Vienna. So he's in possession, but the bridges over the Danube, which is a huge river, have been broken by the retreating Austrians. Why is this going to be a big problem for Napoleon?
Well, I mean, having been to that area, the Danube is not fordable. You have to build a bridge. And like I said, the Austrians have retreated to the other side of the river, and they've destroyed a lot of the bridges over the Danube. So if Napoleon wants to go attack them, which in hindsight, probably not the best idea to do right away, because he takes Vienna on 14 May, and he decides to immediately go after him, okay? In hindsight, probably should have waited a little bit because he's going to wait at Wagram and do some maneuvers to bamboozle Charles. But again, he just makes the decision to go after him right away. It's strategic consumption has taken hold. He has to dispatch forces to the Tyrol. And he's also fearful that Archduke John, who's operating against Napoleon's stepson, Eugene de Beauharnais, in Italy, and he's worried that Archduke John will reinforce Charles, so he sees it's now or never. Well, there's only one bridge. It's destroyed, so they need to hastily build a new one. And because they build it so hastily, they're not going to put up palisades and barriers to protect it. So it's going to be very, I don't want to say flimsy because it can easily get the men across, but it's not protected by a wall to protect it from being destroyed. And this puts his army in great danger because he builds it so quickly, trying to get across the river, that he's not going to have time to deceive the enemy like he will at Wagram. So if this bridge is destroyed, looking ahead, newsflash, if it's destroyed, he's not going to be able to mass his entire army. So this is going to put his army in great danger. What he also doesn't know is that Charles knows his every move, because there's an observatory in Vienna that has been reporting all of the French movements for the past couple days. So the fact that he decides to go after them so quickly leads him to not take the necessary precautions to ensure that his army has a 100% chance of success.
And we'll come back to that, because speed is like the number one thing in Napoleon's army. So if the bridges are broken and he can't get to Charles, unless it's a piecemeal fashion, like one corps at a time, that huge advantage of speed kind of goes away for Napoleon.
Well, and another thing that the Napoleonic army relies on heavily is mutual support. So the corps, they're small but quick, but the benefit to them is that you can take 30,000 men from 20 miles away and all converge at once. If there's no mutual support, then they're in trouble. He'll find this out at Gross Baron in 1813.
Well, let's discuss the sizes of each army for the Battle of Aspern-Essling and some of the famous commanders on each side.
So the Austrians have 115,000 available, and in pretty good order. They suffered 35,000 casualties during the Ratisbon campaign, but they've retreated in good order, and I can't emphasize this enough, they are in a very good defensive position on the other side of the river. The French have only 85,000, okay? So they're outnumbered. Now, they had more at the beginning of the campaign, but due to strategic consumption, dispatching forces to the Tyrol, protecting lines of communication. Also, during campaign, I know we haven't been on campaign, in the Napoleonic army. It's tough. People are going to fall ill. People are going to run away. So the strategic consumption has started to take his toll on Napoleon and the French. So that's why he comes to the conclusion to win the war now. Now, both sides, they're mainly conscript forces. Ironically enough, it's going to be Germans fighting Germans in a lot of ways. The Austrians have a lot of Germans in theirs, and the French do as well. Unlike in 1806 and 7, where it's a lot of Frenchmen, now it's a lot of men from the Confederation of the Rhine. So the famous commanders have obviously the best commander of their time, Archduke Charles, Count Bellegarde, who has fought since the War of the First Coalition. You also have Prince Liechtenstein, who was Emperor Francis's fourth son, who was very experienced. He fought at the Battle of Fleurus in 1794, Hohenlinden, and also at Austerlitz. Now, a lot of our viewers probably haven't heard those names because Austrian commanders don't get the attention, and they're nowhere near the quality of the French commanders. Like for the French, you have Marshal Massena before his reputation goes in the toilet in Spain in 1810 and 11. The infant child of victory, as he was known. Marshal Lannes, we'll have an occasion to talk about him in this battle. Davout and Bernadotte are also on this campaign. They do not partake in this battle, though. Davout was at Acmeal, but he'll be stuck here. And also Bernadotte, he's going to be commanding Saxons, the Saxon Corps. You also have Marshal Bessières, the famous commander of the cavalry. You also have Murat as well. And you also have General Saint Hilaire, who's not a marshal, but still a very famous French commander who was a hero of Austerlitz and Jena.
Yeah, definitely got some big names in this one.
Yeah, and the French quality of commander is way better than anything the Austrians have, it must be noted.
Yeah, it's interesting, though. The battle begins as Napoleon sends troops under Marshals Massena, Lannes, and Bessières from the island of, is it Labau or Lebeau? I don't know.
Lobau.
Okay. In the Danube and over towards the Austrian army at the hamlets of Aspern-Essling. Can you kind of describe the topography of the battlefield? Because I know these French troops are going to have the Danube now at their back, right? And they're facing the Austrians on this. Is it like a plain?
It's kind of a plain. These villages are very dense, but they're spread out by a couple miles. I was able to tour these two areas where the battles took place. There's a very small museum. It was only open on Sundays from the hours of 10 to noon. At Essling. The Wagram Museum's huge, though, so I got to view that. But unfortunately, I was hoping to be able to see, the battlefields, but civilization has taken over.
Yeah.
But it's May, and the Danube had flooded a lot in 1809, so the ground was marshy and the Danube was overflowing in a lot of areas. So the ground was semi-soft. It wasn't like, Waterloo soft. But the important thing is, fighting with the river at your back is always a disaster. It's going to be a fight to the death, just as the Russians at Friedland, how it was having the river at your back.
Yep.
So yeah, there's a couple little islands that span you can get across the Danube. But yeah, there's only one bridge getting over that's going to be hastily built. But topography is not going to be like as much of a factor as other battles you've talked about on your channel.
Okay. Well, the battle begins first day. The town of Aspern changes hands several times as Archduke Charles pours all available troops to knock Marshal Massena's corps into the river. Meanwhile, there's savage fighting over at Essling, where Marshal Lannes holds the town with his single division against the onslaught of the Austrian army. And I think in between the two towns is Marshal Bessier and his cavalry troopers. Why is Marshal Lannes becoming upset with Marshal Bessier?
All right, so I don't know if you or your listeners watch the Kardashians or any sort of like reality TV show, but buckle up because this is interesting. So not to sound improper, but the French marshals, they are some of the cattiest people you will ever meet in your life. It's important to note that they're people and they have personalities and there's rivalries amongst the French marshalate. They're not always looking to, do what's best because, especially in the case of like Berthier, everybody hates him. Everybody hates Berthier because he was like, Napoleon's like right-hand man, and a lot of people hated that. Okay. Yeah. They hated that he got preferential treatment. So the marshals are not like this, congruent, very homogeneous together group that all loves each other. They actually all really hate each other. So the beef between Bessier and Lannes actually goes way back. I did not know a lot about this. I did some research on this the past couple of days, and it's interesting.
Okay.
So they're originally from Gascony. They're from the same region in France, and they were relatively the same age, so they knew each other pretty well. Bessier was even a witness to Lannes' second wedding. So that's pretty good relationship. However, Napoleon, after he became first consul and after the Battle of Marengo in 1800, where Lannes, who was just a general at this point, won't be a marshal until 1804, was appointed the head of the consular guard. Think of it like, the Praetorian Guard was for the Emperor of Rome. Yeah. So, kind of like the bodyguards. Okay. So that's a very prestigious position what Lannes has because, we'll talk about this. Lannes and Napoleon were very close friends. And he was given carte blanche to, make the consular guard fitting of the position, get them new uniforms, outfit them better, make sure they're well taken care of. Napoleon also tells Lannes to buy himself a house that is fitting of his position. Yeah. So Lannes, I can't say I blame him. He's told buy his nice house. So he buys himself a very luxurious palace on the Rue de Saint-Dominique in Paris, which is, now it's right next to the Eiffel Tower. So very nice road in France. He then, after buying himself, a Kardashian-type mansion, turns his attention to the consular guard and basically bears no expense in getting them new uniforms, new beds. One consular guard member said he thanked Lannes proficiently because he had a bed so big now that more than two people could sleep in it. It was so nice. So he's going to run up quite a tab. 300,000. And the tab is 300,000. Yeah. So Napoleon is pretty furious that he ran up such a tab. And there's going to be a group of commanders who plot to make sure that Napoleon knew exactly what the expenses were. That would be Bessier and Murat. So Murat and Bessier get Lannes removed from the consular guard. Lannes lucky. Napoleon was going to have him shot if he didn't pay the whole entire the 300,000 francs back within 8 days. He's bailed out by one of his other friends. I forget which marshal it was.
Marshal Augereau.
Augereau, yes, thank you. Augereau bails him out, basically spares Lannes a court-martial. So Lannes is sent in semi-disgrace to Portugal to be the ambassador. But people have long memories, and Lannes will not forget what Bessier did to him. So that's all going to come to a head at Essling. where after Lannes overhears Bessier complaining about him to Colonel Mabot, Lannes is going to accuse Bessier of holding back. Now, let's give Lannes a little bit of grace. He had fought the whole entire day with one division, holding Essling by himself with no support, had to repel 3 Austrian attacks. So I think he was definitely a little bit annoyed that he was kind of left out on an island and thought Bessier could support him. What he doesn't know is that Bessier was actually very heroic during the battle, launching several cavalry attacks to thwart the Austrian advance. Lannes doesn't care, so they are going to have their words later on.
Yeah, and you mentioned the role of commander of the Councilor Guard, which goes on to be the Imperial Guard. Basically, you're controlling the best troops in the French army and the troops that control access to Napoleon. It's a very prestigious position. And after Lannes is sent off to Portugal, guess who becomes commander of the Imperial Guard? This Bessier. Yeah.
Now, I was looking online because a lot of people are torn which side of it, which side of this debate do you fall on? Are you Team Lannes or Team Bessier? Do you think that Lannes got screwed over? Sure. But also, Bessier thought that, in his mind that, Lannes was spending unnecessary money that wasn't going towards the troops.
Right.
Because, Bessier didn't have a palace on Rue Saint-Dominique. So I think there was definitely a little bit of contention there, but he also thought that funds for the army should not be spent willy-nilly,
right?
Which I can see. I can get on board with that.
We'll come back to that. So the first day ends, and only nightfall really brings a halt to the fighting, and the two forces sleep within pistol shot of each other. What were Napoleon's engineers doing to repair the bridges, and how did the Austrians thwart these repairs? Because I know Marshal Davout's corps is kind of like standing by the whole day waiting for these bridges to be done so they can rush over and help at Aspern and Essling.
So the French engineers, after the bridge had been destroyed, so what the Austrians did several times was they sent flotillas and ships or whatever barges that were on fire, and they sent them at the bridge to destroy it, catch it on fire. So the French had to rebuild it a couple times. So during the night after the first day of the battle, Second Corps made it across to reinforce Napoleon. And then Davout, who always commands 3 Corps, is summoned to the bridgehead to start marching. It's at that point, it's around between 5 and 7 a.m. that the bridge is destroyed. It had been destroyed several times before. The French engineers, who are some of the best, had rebuilt it. The problem is the bridge is destroyed at 7, and that's when Napoleon launches his attack. So Davout's corps is literally just sitting there waiting for the bridge to be repaired, watching the battle take place, and they're just stuck on the wrong side of the river.
Also during the evening, Marshal Lannes and Marshal Bessier getting to a shouting match, which leads them to basically draw swords on each other. What happens there?
I said this briefly earlier, but Lannes is going to overhear Bessier complaining about him behind his back to Colonel Mabot. Bessier is going to accuse Lannes of being incompetent, that he needed to, help him out because Bessier was, fighting hard as well, repelling several attacks. And he's like, hey, where's the Lannes? And Lannes thinks the same thing. So they're just So Lannes, who had an knack for being hot-headed and exploding at the wrong time, basically challenges Bessier to a duel in some cases. They draw swords on each other. But Marshal Massena steps in and cool heads prevail. I don't want to say it was a long time coming, but these guys, they weren't fast friends. They have a long history of beef, and men have a tendency in the heat of battle to get worked up about stuff. So I think they were just very animated and hot because of what happened during the day. I don't really think they would have slashed at each other, but I think there was just a lot of emotions running high in the heat of the moment.
Yeah, and they're both competitive individuals. They're both friends of Napoleon. They're both marshals. So I think you're right. I think it's just the heat of the moment type of thing.
And it must be noted that they are not the only marshals who had beef with each other.
That's true. Well, the second day leads to more desperate fighting in both Aspern and Essling. How do you think Massena and Lannes kept their footholds in these two towns?
Well, they get lucky in the fact that the Austrians, their timing is slightly off. The attacks aren't as coordinated as they can be. So, again, pretty much raw conscripts, and the Austrians are still reforming in a lot of ways, so they're not quite there yet. So the timing's slightly off, but also must be noted, let's give credit to the French. Their determination was incredible. Rugged determination. Their leadership is great. It also must be noted, it's not easy to take cities. close quarters combat. So fighting over little villages and all that, it's going to be very hard to take. But the French fight really, really hard. In a lot of ways, they are still way better trained, way better led than their Austrian counterparts. The other thing is the French. Let's return to Marshal Bessier. The French cavalry support all got on the other side of the river. So cavalry is used in Napoleonic warfare. It was used to blunt attacks a lot. So Bessier did a great job of realizing where the weaknesses were and where the momentum was and launching attacks and thwarting Austrian advances. So Essling actually falls at one point, but the young guard is sent in at the last second, and due to their bravery, taking the town at bayonet point, they take Essling. So a lot of hard will, determination, skillful fighting by the French, that's what holds it against the Austrians. And also the Austrians make mistakes, the timing's slightly off. They don't coordinate as well, and their leadership is not great compared to the French.
Well, the French are still holding the towns, both towns, barely, but the bridges are again knocked down by heavy barges and windmills sent downstream by the Austrians, like you said. And I guess at this point, Napoleon's just like, I have to cut my losses, right? Because I cannot get more, not only troops, but ammunition, food, supplies. I can't get anything over this Danube, so he has to pull back, right?
Yeah. So by 4 p.m., there's a lot of reports that most men are down to maybe a shot or two. So they don't have any ammo left, so you have to get out now. They're also very much overwhelmed numerically, and there's no reinforcements coming. Like you said, the bridges have been destroyed. So this is basically just a meat grinder at this point. So you have to get out now to avoid further losses, okay? Because if you lose the entire army now, then the war is you could lose the war, and also he wants to live to fight another day. The other thing is men are men, they're people, and they are exhausted. They've been fighting for 2 days. Those who aren't dead are probably begging for death at this point. They've been fighting so hard. You couldn't ask any more out of them. And we've talked about this a couple times, but these aren't the same, warriors that were in 1805 and 6. These are raw conscripts that you just can't ask the same level out of them.
Mm-hmm.
They aren't as well trained, and he realized that the men are just absolutely exhausted. As the saying goes, maybe lose one battle to win the war later on, and that's what he realizes. That he had no chance of winning. He wasn't going to win, so
right.
He just has to pull out and save what he can to launch an attack later on.
Well, other than Napoleon suffering his first defeat in 10 years, the worst part of the day was yet to come. Marshal Lannes, who's generally considered one of his best independent commanders, was among the last Frenchmen to retreat. And he's in mid-conversation with his friend and mentor, General Pouzet, who was decapitated by a cannonball shot. What happens to Lannes after that?
So, very unfortunate story. Tragic. So, Lannes, has been holding Essling for the better part of 2 days, and they're walking away, and he's having, a conversation with General Pouzet. I don't think we can really put into words how that probably felt for Lannes, who is his friend, is just, his cannonball takes his head off. Mm-hmm. So blood sprays all over Marshal Lannes. He then walks away to compose himself. Because obviously he just saw what he saw. He sits down, crosses his legs underneath a tree to compose himself, puts his head in his hands. It's at that point that a cannonball smashes through his knees, both his knees, causing great damage. He tries to get up, says, "Oh, I'm wounded, help me up." Can't get up. So he's immediately rushed off the battlefield, and within the span of 2 minutes, they amputate his right leg because it was powder at this point, and then the other one's left to heal. But Lannes is going to die 8 days later on the 31st of May of an infection. He's the first marshal to die in a battle, and also he was Napoleon's close friend. Napoleon famously remarked afterwards, quote, "What a loss for France, what a loss for me." But Lannes was, in my opinion, his second best independent commander, other than Davout. Mm-hmm. Wherever Lannes went, he inspired, patriotism and, inspired the men to fight harder than they ever could have imagined. So this is a great loss for the French army. And then Napoleon personally, now the war is really starting to take a personal toll on him. And ironically enough, the second marshal to die in battle will be Bessier a couple years later.
what are the chances? Yeah, I think does Saint Hilaire perish as well?
He gets a cannonball that takes his foot off, and that's going to kill him later on.
So, what are the casualty numbers on both sides?
So the French lost 20,000. That was 33% of their force that was available for the battle. And the Austrians lost 23,000.
When you say lost, though, that's killed, wounded, and captured.
Killed, wounded, captured, go away.
Right.
So just in total casualties. Not dead. Not 20,000 dead, but 20,000 that will not be available for service in the near future.
So Napoleon regroups and later defeats the Austrians at the Battle of Wagram 6 weeks later. So I guess in theory, Aspern-Essling isn't a huge setback, but it kind of is in Europe for Napoleon. What do you think the legacy of this battle is?
Well, it was the first loss for him. That aura of invincibility is gone. He hadn't lost until that point, so nobody really knew if it was possible to beat him. But now that aura of invincibility and infallibility was gone. For the Austrians, it also proves that the reforms are working. But it must be noted that this French army in 1809 they are not in the same league as the Grande Armée of 1805. There's a lot of raw conscripts from the German-speaking territories. They are trained a lot of times, like on the battlefield. And a lot of people criticize Napoleon's tactics from here on out. Like you'll see it Borodino with mass frontal assaults. And a lot of historians will say that he was, just some bloodletter who was just sacrificing young men. He doesn't have the men to conduct, expert movements. So from here on out, you're going to see Napoleon drastically change his art of war because he can't rely on these complex flanking maneuvers. It's going to be a lot of go right at the enemy and hopefully they lose. Okay. Hopefully you overwhelm the enemy because the composition of the French armies is nowhere near what it used to be.
Yeah.
However, it also must be remembered that Napoleon is still the best general of the time at this point, and this campaign still shows a lot of his versatility. For Metternich, though, who in 1813 will become the prime minister of the coalition, this 1809 war teaches him several lessons. Firstly is that, you need alliances to win wars because the Austrians were on their own and they lost. But he's also going to remember that you're going to have to be wary of your alliance partners. In 1813, he's going to be wary of getting into alliance, but he wants Austria to win. So it shows that you need alliances in order to win.
Yeah, and I've seen Bonapartists and Napoleonic fans say, well, he didn't lose. He just retreated and then beat him 6 weeks later. And I'm like, he lost. He didn't surrender at the battle or anything like that, but it was still a setback for him.
Well, and it also, because he learns a lot from this one. He learns, 6 weeks later, he's like, hey, let's build up the army and let's do some deceptive movements. So he takes a lot of lessons from Aspern-Essling, and he's not going to make the same mistakes again at Wagram. He's going to absolutely annihilate the Austrians at Wagram. Mm-hmm. And then at Znaim a couple of days after.
Yeah, that's an interesting legacy for sure. Well, thank you as always for that, Nick. That was fantastic. Again, my friend Nick is on X Twitter, which you can find at nkramer5812. And yeah, great stuff, man. Always a pleasure having you on the show.
Oh, yeah, it was great, John. Look forward to doing this again in the future. It's always great talking to you.